Hello, my name is T.L. Goodwin, and today I'm going to be making a hollow stamped copper bead. The first step is to acquire a couple of metal discs. In this case, we're going to use copper. I'm going to be using a disc cutter, an inexpensive disc cutter, but feel free to use a more expensive disc cutter, or you can mark the metal with a template and cut the disc out by hand. I thought maybe the inexpensive disc cutter would be worth my time versus hand cutting, which I did for many years. So I thought, all right, let's use a disc cutter. And I was right. This inexpensive disc cutter has saved me a lot of time. It's well worth it. If you're lucky, you might cut the disc out with one hit. If you're not so lucky, it might take three. No matter what method you use to cut the discs out, two things now have to happen. The flash has to be removed from the edges. There always seems to be some. The little jagged metal bits, they need to be filed off. Also, you need to find center. Here I'm using a blue Sharpie, which in case of a mistake is easily wiped away, even though it's supposed to be a permanent marker. Any little bits of extra metal can hamper the stamping process. So at the very least, you want these pieces to be flush. I generally mark the center by eye and then turn the piece to make sure that my center mark is correct. The file I'm using is one of my go-to files. I use it only on precious metal and steel. I have separate files for working with aluminum and then with wood. As I was saying, I mark disc center by eye, and then I rotate the disc to see whether or not I'm correct in my assessment, and if I need to change it, I will. Once the center is found, it's time to put a hole in the disc. You might mark the center with a centering punch, and then go ahead and drill out the hole. But I find that the best way to do it is to use a hole punch. There are screw type hole punches, and then there are lever action hole punches. I prefer my lever action hole punch. I also use this tool to make riveting washers and end caps. I attached a copper tool that I made that I use to aid in the release of the copper piece from the hole press. The press comes with different size holes. I do most of my light piercing with this tool. It covers the smaller sizes that the larger hole cutter does not. I have to put a few things away before I can bring out my anvil. Now, this little anvil I'm about to pull up is really important to me. It was given to me by my second cousin's wife. It belonged to her father. And being a Washington native and of 5 generations, it's kind of cool to know that this anvil was cast in Wenatchee, Washington. Its drawback is that it's not tempered so that it easily takes the brunt of a blow and is rather scarred. But there is a clean area, and that's the area that I'm going to be stamping on. Now, the stamping tool I use that I'm going to use here is a horse stamp. And I designed the horse stamp after having looked at a number of petroglyph designs. I kind of added them all in together in my head and drew the design out on the steel, and then filed the steel away, leaving the impression of the horse. Stamp making is a wonderful thing to learn. Once you learn it, you become free to use your own individualized designs. This is something I really enjoy doing. Even though I've been stamping for approximately 28 years, I still screw up from time to time. Hopefully that won't happen with this bead. But I was lucky enough here to get good impressions. Here you can see really well the scarring on the anvil. So after you're finished stamping, you have to anneal the piece again. And I suppose that's one thing I should have mentioned, is that the metal was annealed prior to cutting. In the starting of this video, I use a 3-pound sledgehammer for stamping, and you'll see that it's painted red. The red side is the general purpose side, which I use for stamping, and the unpainted side has been cleaned and buffed to a point where it poses little problem for forging. So it's the forging side. I don't own a lot of hammers. I only have a few, and so sometimes they have to play double duty. So the pieces are annealed, and now it's time to dome them. Always quench your piece after it's faded from red hot, never while it's red hot. That can cause stress fractures. So now remove the anvil and grab the dapping block. I own a fairly decent dapping block set. I also have a wooden dapping block, which I often use. If you don't have a dapping block set, you could always make one out of hardwood. Hardwood holds up really well, especially if you ensure that the piece that you're working with has been annealed beforehand. But sometimes wood isn't enough, and you might have to resort to steel. You choose a depression in the dapping block that's roughly the size that you want your bead to be. With this set, you could make a spherical bead by choosing the right holes on the dapping block. I prefer a more lenticular shape. You have to make sure that each half of the bead is completely flat. This helps to ensure a proper solder joint. My preferred method is to use a 180 diamond grit lap on my BNI gem maker. This particular machine was given to me by my great-great uncle when I was a young boy. I recently re-sleeved the spindle for $10 after having used it for 26 years. I created a custom motor mount, and I repainted it, keeping the original Craftsman placard. This machine has seen a lot of cabs. This 180 disc is used for a number of different things, like shell, bone, glass, steel, copper, brass, and sometimes wood. The only time I change the disc is if I'm cabbing. You really do need to have these two pieces perfectly flat so that they can join together completely for the soldering process. I'd like to take this time to thank Heather, my wife, for doing such a great job behind the camera. Thank you, Heather. BNI started making the gem maker back in 1947, just after World War II. I believe they stopped producing in the beginning of the 1970s. They had a couple of different models. It was also a saw and could be purchased with an optional, yet primitive, index-style faceting head. So now it comes to soldering. I use self-pickling flux. My area is just clean, so I shouldn't have a problem. After you're done painting on the flux, it's time to apply the solder. I prefer using Palians of sheet solder. It is silver solder, and in this case I'm going to be using EZ or soft. You want to place the Palians of solder as close to the edge as you possibly can. Solder doesn't like to travel on dirty copper, so you really have to have those Palians of solder right next to a clean surface. Since these pieces are made out of copper, feel free to add more solder. It's not like you're going to be changing the composition much. In doing this work in silver, it's frowned upon to use an excess of silver solder. But this isn't an issue with copper, brass, or bronze. Once you feel you have enough solder on the first half of the bead, it's time to put the second half on top. You want to center that as well as you can. And then when you hit the torch, hit it with a torch. Start from high up, especially if you're using self-pickling flux. You want to have that flux evaporate slowly. If it evaporates too rapidly, it can kick the solder off the piece, and then you'll have to reposition the solder. Once the liquid has evaporated, then you want to go in as fast as you can to prevent oxides from building up on your copper. Solder doesn't like to flow through oxides, so you bring it to temperature fast. Watch for the solder to flow. There. So after it's quenched, you inspect the piece and make sure that the solder is flowed all the way around the bead. If it hasn't, you're going to have to deal with that. I'm going to have to deal with that with this bead right now, as the solder didn't flow all the way around. And I have like one window, and this is it, to do it without having to dip it in pickling solution and getting it all cleaned up. It's clean enough where I might be able to get that to happen. Might be able to get the solder to flow. So here I go. Paint those Palians as close to the edge as possible. I've been making my own stamping tools since 1994, but in the last 10 years I've gotten fairly serious about it. I once used any kind of tool steel I could find, but now I'm focusing on understanding the quality and using a water-cooled drill rod so I have some kind of control. But I still will use steel from unknown sources and of unknown composition. In the beginning, I used a lot of mild steel. They'll hold up for a time. I've used bolts. I particularly like using chisels, and screwdrivers have always been popular with me. Now, when you do the resoldering, same rules apply. Get in there as quickly as you can, just not too fast, or you'll kick the solder off the object. Once you know everything's stable, just get right in there. Yep, get right in there. And get that thing to flow where you need it to flow as rapidly as possible. There you go. And if you end up with excess solder on the outside, it doesn't really matter because you're going to file all the silver off as much as you can anyway in the next coming step. There I have to prod it along with the titanium pick, and once I'm comfortable with it, then it's the time for quenching. Make sure it's not red hot. So right now is the perfect time to put it in pickling solution. If you wait until it's riveted, then the pickling solution just might seep in and be like impossible to get out. So you don't want to do that after you've put the rivet in. I'm putting stuff away. I like to keep myself just a little tidy. I'm going to grab my go-to file here in a second and going to start filing down the bead edge, make it all nice and smooth. I've only started making metal beads recently. I've been making gemstone beads for quite a long time. And I have dabbled in lampwork bead making myself, though that's generally Heather's job. I have so many other things to do that's fine by me anyway. But sometimes I do miss glass. I built my shop. I built my benches. Not only have I made all of my own stamping tools, but I've also made chasing tools, cutting chisels. But one thing I really like to do is to make swage blocks. And that's a completely separate subject from this. I think swage blocks are really cool. More on that later. But for now, I'm just trying to finish up this bead. I also really enjoy making contour stamps. A contour stamp is a die created to create a repeatable contour in a ring or bracelet or any piece of metal for any purpose whatsoever. And more on that also at some other point. Hey, you can see my bench pin up there. It's one of 2 bench pins. You can tell I made it myself. I'm a big proponent of make your own bench pin for your own particular reasons. I'm a big proponent of that. So I wanted to do this video from beginning to end. I think we've lost a couple of seconds somewhere along the line. It's actually composed of 3 different videos, and I know there was some loss there. And so far we're at 18 minutes from the beginning. It's going to clock in at about 25 minutes. You can see that little plywood platform. I use that for staging of all kinds of different things. And it is cut to not be in the way of my bench pin. Now, when you're finished with this point, now for sure would be a good time to put it in pickling solution. This way it'll drain out rather nicely before putting in the rivet. But for the sake of speed, I'm just going to go ahead and do it now. The tubing I selected is the same size as the hole I made in the 2 discs. And I'm going to cut a piece that has approximately 2.5 millimeters, maybe 3 millimeters on either side of the bead itself. Now I'm going to start the cut so that I know where to mark it. But the bead doesn't have to be on the tube. Continue cutting. After you're done cutting, clean up the ends. I could take it back to the B&I gem maker, or I could use a file. Sometimes it's just quicker to use a file. So again, my go-to. I have another go-to file that I use. I ground down all of the teeth on the side so that it didn't mark anything at a 90-degree angle. Modifying pliers is also fun. At some point, I'd like to experience more blacksmithing, but for now, I'm more than happy doing what I'm doing. Well, here I am looking for my bench block, and it's just right in front of my face. There we go. I choose the bench block over the anvil because it has a lower profile. I'm using a punch that I cut to a 45-degree angle to start the flaring of the rivet. You can see there the dapping punch, which will also be used in this process. I'm using the bead itself as a holder to get this thing started. It's being kind of ornery. But with some persistence, I'm going to get this under control. Okay, I'll drop it down and place in the die, stamp, flaring tool, and get that flare started. Yep, now flip it over, because that bead isn't going anywhere, and start the other side's flare. And there you are, it's begun. Flare it out a little more, flip it over. Notice we're pretty close to where we want it. Go ahead and bang it in. And there you go. One side done. Next side, let's go ahead and take that dapping punch and give it a little bit of more of a start. And once you're comfortable, bang it in. And there you go. It is a bead. It is complete. Now the only thing left to do is to clean it up. In this case, we can't use pickling solution, so I'm going to use an old piece of 400 grit wet dry. And I'm not going to do much more than that. I actually prefer the oxides in the indentations left by the stamping tools. It's a nice alternative to liver of sulfur. So I'm not going to spend any time at all trying to remove that from the piece. Where if I did have it in pickling solution, I would have been compelled to either darken it with a torch again or by using liver of sulfur. After about 23 minutes, here we are at this stage. So hey, if you've enjoyed watching this process and would like to see similar videos, please like and subscribe or become a patron on Patreon, and we will do our very best to present to you interesting videos about our creative processes. In other words, we can really only do this with your support. And thank you. Incidentally, the copper used in this bead is taken from an old light hood that I received in trade for doing computer work approximately 20 years ago. So it is completely and utterly recycled. Well, except for the tubing, which was brand new, yet still. How long has it been?
25 minutes.
It's about ready to shut off, I'm sure.
It's already made 3 videos, it says.
Okay. I'll be done in a second.
Hmm?
I'll be done in a second. Of course, more finishing can be done, but